So for people who like, do you ever get accused, I guess, if you take a stance on this before we get to anything involving, like, say, U.S. imperialism or anything like that, of being like pro Putin if you were to say condemn his actions?
It's not serious. Like, I just think I just all those sorts of accusations wipe off my back, because they ultimately, I mean, what does that mean? You're anti-American empire if you're questioning what the United States should do in the world. I mean, those are such ridiculous criticisms, and I think they all ultimately come from the fact that most people just accept the status quo, the geopolitical position that they find that the United States finds itself in, and so anything sort of that goes against the assumption that the United States should rule all areas of the world and now and forever, and should have an interest in literally every area of the world, which is of relatively recent provenance. I date it to World War II and the immediate period afterward, is a critique, is somehow anti-American.
For people who don't fully understand what is taking place, could you give a quick background to the current Ukraine/Russia crisis and how we found ourselves in the position that we are in today?
Sure. How far do you want me to go back? I can go back to
Let's go to
the end of the Soviet Union.
That's 91, right?
2014, or I could go back to last year. Let's
go back to the 9th century.
Yeah, we could go back to the 9th century, really, frankly. But no, how far do you want me to go back?
Yeah, why don't we start around the fall, maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe, or just something that contextualizes perhaps why I've heard before that people on the left don't understand, particularly even if they are and they claim to be anti-imperialist or whatever, they don't quite understand the motivations behind someone like Vladimir Putin, why he would have interest in that region specifically, and why perhaps this is more of a problem than other conflicts that may be taking place.
Well, I mean, the links between Ukraine and Russia do go back to the 9th century or even earlier, to Kievan Rus, really. So we could go back that far. But these are two peoples who have had a long history together. They went their separate ways when the Soviet Union came to an end, the fall of the Berlin Wall, as you say, and that period. Ukraine and Russia became independent of the then collapsed Soviet Union. They maintained close relations until 2014 and what was called the Euromaidan movement. There was a protest against the Russian-friendly government of Ukraine at the time, weeks of large demonstrations in Kiev, some possible involvement of U.S. folks, let's say. I don't want to, cast aspersions without hard evidence, but what wound up happening was they ousted the government that was in place at the time, the pro-Russian government. The Russians responded to this by sending forces into Crimea. They seized Crimea. They've annexed Crimea, which was the one part of Ukraine that Russia really valued having access to. And they've been supporting a separatist movement in the Donbass region, which is in the far east part of Ukraine, around the cities of Luhansk and Donetsk. They've been supporting that ever since. So that's the background. You can fast forward then to really last year. There's been an ongoing kind of back and forth peace process that had pretty much broken down by last year. It seems to have picked up again now in terms of the Ukrainian civil war. The Russians have started now, as of last year, basically started doing this thing where they organize military exercises in the region of Ukraine, around the Ukrainian borders. They amass a large number of military forces in a sort of menacing way, and then, let everybody in the Ukraine and the West kind of sweat it out a little bit. And they've done that again now. So they did that once last year, and it really came to naught. They've done it again, and they've still got these forces positioned all around Ukraine, really conducting exercises. And the U.S., the West, NATO are convinced, it seems like, that this is all the precursor to a Russian invasion. I'm skeptical of that, but that's basically where things stand now. The tension is over a possible invasion.
Derek.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I agree with Derek.
All right. So then, if you look at it from the perspective, like, we have a little bit of background as to why that's happening. do you think in the current climate, like when we hear, obviously we're kind of inundated with news from the West that this is a act of aggression and that the positioning of 100,000 troops near the border is something that is intentionally being done by Vladimir Putin as a move, as a precursor perhaps to an invasion of Ukraine. Is that the whole story? Like what exactly is the background to the troop deployment in that area?
Well, I mean, from the Russian perspective, the issue is Ukraine potentially becoming a member of NATO. The Russians feel, not without cause, that they have been betrayed to some extent, that there were promises made in the 1990s, again, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that NATO would sort of stick to its end of the Cold War borders. NATO has expanded uh, rapidly to the east over the last couple of decades. And Ukraine now, since 2014, now it has a very pro-Western, not just government, but political orientation. I mean, the Russian intervention has sort of soured the Ukrainian people on Russia to a large extent. There are concerns in Russia that NATO could absorb Ukraine, that Ukraine could wind up as a NATO member, which could lead to all sorts of things like the positioning of U.S. troops or U.S. Weaponry in Ukraine, which the Russians would see as a security threat. There's a deeper nationalist thing, which is why I said we could go all the way back to the 9th century. There are deeper nationalist concerns about the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and the idea of losing Ukraine to the West, I think, plays into Putin's thinking to some degree, especially as he seems increasingly to be close to the end of what I would say the end of his political career. I think he's thinking in terms of a legacy, and that kind of thing enters his thinking. But mainly, it's over the possibility of NATO expanding into Ukraine.
Yeah, and there's a deeper Cold War history about Khrushchev giving, quote unquote, giving the Crimea to Ukraine, and whether that's legitimate in the eyes of a Russian nationalist and things along those lines. So it's important both symbolically and then also in terms of a geostrategy to a Russian sort of foreign policy perspective.
I'm just curious why you think Putin's at the end of his political career. I know it's a side note, but
well, I mean, he's older.
He's old.
He's hasn't said that he's going to run for president again, even though he sort of engineered a new constitution that would allow him to, even though he's technically was term limited. He's arranged it so that he could run again, but he hasn't said that he's going to. There were rumors going around last year. I don't know how much credence to give them, but that he may be ailing from something. I think taken in the whole, my assumption, and I realize I'm sort of trying to play armchair psychologist, but my assumption is he's starting to think about things in terms of, like, what am I leaving behind? What is my record?
Sorry, Daniel, I thought you were going to say something there, but
no. I mean, I think Derek's right.
So for people who, like, do you ever get accused, I guess, if you take a stance on this before we get to anything involving, like, say, U.S. imperialism or anything like that, of being like pro Putin, if you were to say condemn his actions?
It's not serious. Like, I just think I just all those sorts of accusations wipe off my back, because they ultimately, I mean, what does that mean? That you're pro-American empire if sorry, you're anti-American empire if you're questioning what the United States should do in the world. I mean, those are such ridiculous criticisms, and I think they all ultimately come from the fact that most people just accept the status quo, the geopolitical position that they find that the United States finds itself in, and so anything sort of that goes against the assumption that the United States should rule all areas of the world and now and forever, and should have an interest in literally every area of the world, which is of relatively recent provenance. I date it to World War II and the immediate period afterward, is a critique, is somehow anti-American. And I mean, we don't have to go into this, but there's a long and proud tradition that actually comes from the right that is very skeptical of American intervention abroad. So it's ironic when these things sort of get twisted in how people actually think about the U.S. role in the world. I don't know, Derek, how do you feel about that? I remember during Trump, like a writer called me like a Trumpist for saying that like the United States shouldn't do wars abroad. And I actually kind of like it because it's so ridiculous and so funny, and it's just going to look so bad in 5 years' time that I don't really care. You know, it's kind of being a slightly public figure. You have to deal with the slings and arrows of the world.
Yeah, I don't get accused of this kind of stuff. I think it's because I'm not important enough for people to care. Which is a nice place
I
to
think
be,
you're
frankly.
important, Derek.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But no, I mean, I don't usually get these kinds of things lobbed at me. Maybe it's just because I stay in my spider hole online. But I agree with Danny. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, you know, to say that I don't think the United States has an interest in Ukraine. I don't think that the United States has a sphere
How
of influence
dare
that
you?
extends to Ukraine that can
You won't
match
die for the Donbass, Derek.
Russia's
You don't want to die
interest.
for the Donbass.
Like, you know, I don't think that makes me pro Putin. I think that would be an absurd thing to extrapolate from that.
Just to build on that, I think people have been socialized to think that the United States and particularly their individual selves as Americans need to have like a take on every area of the world, which is really an artifact and function of imperialism. Like I just don't think from any perspective, ethical, realistic, moral, what have you, that a citizen in the United States should have a say in what happens all over the world. But that's what we're taught, and so when you go against that, you're kind of attacking individuals' sense of themselves, particularly people who have made their lives in the foreign policy establishment. So like I get it why they're emotionally hurt by my perfect geopolitical takes, but I just don't take it that seriously.
Okay, I mean my sense is like the podcast that we're doing, if there's anything that it leaves behind or anything that it achieves, if we can get people to stop immediately asking what should the United States do and instead make their first question, should the United States be doing anything at all in this situation, I think that would be a valuable thing. We just jump, the foreign policy establishment jumps immediately to what should we do, and I think that's at best should be the second question that they're asking in any of these situations.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we beseech thee to smite down our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble court jesters, here to amuse you. To our lords, Trevor R., we give thanks for this spit of land for us to eke out this meager existence. To our knights, Merid, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Ellie Leslie, Alex P., Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Val 9000, Jenna Tall, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Yanis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Cern 42, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our flag in a veil, and we salute you, our friends.